Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this dinner this evening. I'm Ed Jeredjian, the founding director of the Baker Institute, and before we proceed, it's my honor to introduce to the podium Ed Emmett, our distinguished county judge of Harris County. Ed?
Thank you, Ambassador. Premier, welcome. I always have to say, as county judge, as I mentioned to you earlier, I'm neither a judge nor a lawyer. It's just one of those Texas terms. Anywhere else it would be called the county executive. But I'm particularly pleased to be here today to welcome you, not only to Harris County, but also to the city of Houston. We have a unique circumstance, particularly in these surroundings. The mayor of Houston and the county judge of Harris County are both graduates of Rice University. So we take great pride in that and take great pride at having you on campus. To put Harris County in perspective for you, I believe it was last year when we celebrated the anniversary of Neil Armstrong landing on the moon. And if you remember, the first word he uttered was Houston, and then he said, the eagle has landed. My life would have been made a lot easier if he had said Harris County, the eagle has landed. Then I wouldn't have to explain to people what Harris County is. But in all seriousness, as a former member of the Texas House of Representatives who was chairman of the House Energy Committee, as a former employee of Exxon, and as the son and grandson of Humble Oil employees, it is great to have you here, and we welcome you and thank you for taking your time to be with us this evening. So welcome to Harris County and to Houston. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege and honor to introduce this evening's very special guest. We are very pleased to host this special Energy Forum event of the Baker Institute, and I would like to thank our sponsors for this event, Apache Corporation and Chevron Corporation, for their very generous support. As Premier of Western Australia, our speaker represents a state that will play an increasingly important role in international energy markets for years and indeed decades to come. Australia has always been a secure and reliable energy exporter to the global community. But as tonight's speaker will explain, we believe that this role will be augmented in the coming years in good measure because of the smart and effective energy policy of Western Australia. Western Australia has three key advantages as an energy supplier. The first is an abundance of resources, especially natural gas. The second is a strong investment climate marked by modern infrastructure, high political stability, and robust rule of law. The third is its position roughly midway between the high-growth economies of East Asia and the Indian subcontinent. And the Premier shared with me his future itinerary, and believe me, it's in those directions. There is a saying among old energy hands that natural gas is a lot like real estate. Its three most important characteristics are location, location, location. Well, Western Australia's location could not be more favorable in terms of access to the world's natural gas markets. Western Australia is not only poised to become an ever greater supplier of liquefied natural gas, LNG, to major emerging economies such as China and India, it will also help these economies as they shift to cleaner fuels like natural gas for electrical power generation. The Baker Institute Energy Forum is bullish on natural gas. Our analysis indicates that natural gas will in many ways be the fuel of choice as emerging and developed economies alike make the transition to a lower carbon future. A deep and efficient international market in LNG will be critical in this transition, and Western Australia in turn will be a key player in that market. Our speaker is extraordinarily qualified by expertise, experience to address his state's current and future role in international energy markets. First elected to Western Australia's Legislative Assembly in 1990, he rose rapidly within the Liberal Party, serving as Minister of Resource Development and Energy, Minister of Education, Minister of Tourism, and Leader of the Opposition. He became Premier in September 2008. He's an economist by education. Our speaker has worked in academia, government, and the private sector before entering politics. I, for one, am keenly looking forward to his remarks. Mr. Premier, you have a very friendly audience here in America and obviously here in Texas and Harris County and Houston. And, you know, Americans love the Aussies, and I've just got, there's a joke about the differences between Aussies, Brits, Americans, and Canadians that I would like to share with you. Aussies believe you should look out for your mates. Brits believe that you should look out for those people who belong to your club. Americans believe that people should look out for and take care of themselves. And Canadians believe that all that is the government's job. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to the Premier of Western Australia, the Honourable Colin Barnett. Mr. Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for that introduction, and also to the County Judge of Harris County. And can I say how pleased I am to be in Harris County? And a happy coincidence also includes Houston. Ladies and gentlemen, first could I, in responding to the comments by our County Judge, he referred to Neil Armstrong's first words from the moon. Western Australia and Texas have a great deal in common, and one part of that is part of the history of space exploration. We became famous for a brief period when John Glenn, when he orbited the world for the first time, flew over Perth and spotted us from space. And suddenly Perth was known as the City of Lights. I remember as a small boy standing outside shining a torch vertically so we would be noticed. And Perth was a very sleepy little town in those days, but that gave us some acclaim. And indeed, the association through space exploration continued through the Apollo programs, including a tracking station in Western Australia relaying messages back to the Houston Centre, and indeed, even Skylab in 1979 managed to burn, disintegrate and crash to Earth over Western Australia. And a good friend of mine has a fair amount of Skylab in his garage if you ever want to retrieve it. All these titanium cylinders. Can I say it's a great honour and a great pleasure to be at Rice University and at the Baker Institute. Both institutions enjoy a very well-deserved and high international reputation. It's also great to be in the great state of Texas. Western Australia has a lot in common with Texas, in addition to our association through the history of space exploration. Both states are large. For both states, distance, vastness and travel time is a factor. Both states have a prosperity that is largely born out of a natural resource endowment, primarily to this point minerals in Western Australia, oil for Texas. And both states have a very healthy independent streak in terms of the way in which they see their state and their future within the federations that we both are part of. I find Texans to display a very much a can-do attitude. I think that is your history, and it's an approach that Western Australia also prides itself on. Nothing seems to us to be too difficult or too hard. What I'd like to do this evening is say a little bit about the Western Australian economy, particularly for those who may not have visited Western Australia or indeed may not have visited Australia. I would like to say a little bit about our history and particularly then talk about natural gas, which is the prime focus. But in doing so, to talk about some of the public policy issues that relate to this period of expansion. Public policy issues in the domestic or West Australian market, and also some of the international issues, particularly in the East Asian region. First, Australia. Australia is a top 20 nation. It is a prosperous, successful country. The values, the living standards, the political system, the freedoms and rights of individuals are comparable to the United States. Australia is a Western democracy. What is unusual about Australia in this century is that for the last 200 years, Australia had felt isolated. Here we were, a Western democracy, tucked down somewhere in the southern Pacific, distant from the Americas, distant from Europe, and that was always a pervading influence in the development of Australian psyche. For this century, suddenly Australia finds itself, as it is, perched on the southern edge of Asia and close to the most rapidly expanding economies on the globe. We find ourselves in the right place at the right time. And Australia is transforming itself from being an interested observer to a full participant in the expansion and the growth of a modern Asia. I think you would agree with me that the expansion and development of the major Asian economies will prove to be the economic phenomenon of this century, and no doubt a political and social phenomenon of similar scale. For my state of Western Australia, it is a mining-based economy. However, can I stress that it is not solely mining and petroleum. It has a strong agricultural sector, has a growing tourism industry, it has 5 universities, has a high enrolment of graduate and postgraduate students, particularly from Southeast Asia and North Asian countries. It has a world-class medical system. I don't think we quite rival Texas Medical Centre, but it is a very strong, sophisticated system. So it's a first world nation in every sense. But it is mining and it is petroleum that defines the West Australian economy. If you think of Australia as a mining-based economy, if you think of the Australian dollar as a commodity-driven currency, then that is largely due to Western Australia. Our history has gone through 3 great periods of development. A gold mining boom in the 1890s, and a young American mining engineer called Herbert Hoover was one who came to make his fame and fortune. Probably a good thing he left when he did. There was a book that was never written, I think. The second was a period of rapid development in the 1960s, associated with the post-war reconstruction of the Japanese economy. And third is the period we're going through now, which I'll return to. But for Western Australia, it is the dominant part of the Australian mining industry. Western Australia accounts for 62% of all of Australia's mineral production. It accounts for 73% of natural gas production and 66% of oil production. There are over 500 commercial mining and petroleum projects in the state. The total value of mining and petroleum production was $70 billion last year. Bear in mind, a year of relatively low prices. For the future, and by that I define as the next 5 to 7 years, I believe there will be something in the order of $170 billion worth of new mining and petroleum projects either be constructed or move into construction. It is an investment cycle that is of global significance, somewhat extraordinary for a state with only 2.2 million people. The significance of Western Australia as a mining economy is perhaps more easily seen if you look at the major minerals produced and the share of world trade. Western Australia, for example, produces 19% of the world's iron ore, that is total production of iron ore on the planet. Significantly, the state accounts for 37% of international seagoing trade in iron ore. It is a dominant market position in a very basic and critical commodity. We produce 20% of the world's alumina, 15% of the world's nickel, 17% of the world's titanium mineral sands, 6% of the world's gold, and relevant to this audience, currently 7% of the world's liquefied natural gas in terms of the trade in natural gas. The other aspect is not only is Western Australia strong in mining, and as we heard earlier, Houston, or should I say Harris County, is clearly the energy capital of the world. If Houston is the energy capital of the world, then I can claim equally that Western Australia is the mining capital of the world. It has a unique and diversified resource endowment. Not only is Western Australia dominant in the Australian context and internationally in minerals, it has been Western Australia that has been at the front of Australia's emerging and growing relationship with Asia. Western Australia has economically led Australia in its relations with Asia. Today, the state accounts for about a third of Australia's exports. Our population is 10% of the total. But I think most significantly, the major trading partner and export market for Western Australia over recent decades has been Japan. Western Australia provides still today 33% of all of Australia's exports to Japan. With the emergence of China, Western Australia supplies 66% of all of Australia's exports to China, and with the emerging Indian economy and our trading relationship, we supply 42% of Australia's exports. The point I make is Western Australia is at the forefront of our trade, of our investment relationship with Asia. With the natural resource endowment that we are fortunate to have, it is hardly surprising that the world's major mining and petroleum companies have a big interest. The two biggest mining companies in the world, BHP and Rio Tinto, would each have around 1/3 of their global assets in Western Australia. From an American perspective, Alcoa, Newmont, Newcrest have major positions and probably company-determining reserves, in the case of gold and alumina, in our state. The major services companies are very present. In the petroleum industry, the sponsors for tonight, Chevron, Apache, are big players, as are ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, all of the major petroleum companies, and now increasingly all of the major petroleum service companies equally are big players. Our prosperity as a state has depended on overseas investment and the participation of quality companies, such as those I've mentioned, who have been long-term participants in our economy and play an absolutely vital role in the prosperity that I believe lies ahead. That's great. Fantastic to have a natural resource endowment like that. Fantastic to be close to the rapidly growing Chinese, Indian economies, and what I suspect is a strengthening of Japan and other economies. But there are a lot of public policy issues that come with that good fortune. From a West Australian perspective first, there has for a long time been a desire that we should do more with our mining and petroleum resources. The debate that is still current in Western Australia, no doubt very similar to the debate in Houston 30 years ago. Same sort of issues. The conventional wisdom is that companies that develop mineral resources or petroleum resources should transform them into higher value products. Now, the way in which major mining and petroleum projects developed in Western Australia is quite unique. They were developed and facilitated under special state government legislation, the so-called State Agreement Acts. And these pieces of legislation account for 80% of all mining and petroleum production in the state. And the Agreement Acts did a number of things. They gave the companies security over the natural resource, long-term security of access. They gave the right to develop ports, railways, mines, townships where necessary. They also placed a mutual obligation on the developers, on the companies. And amongst those obligations, which included housing and local employment and a fair opportunity for local contractors, was also a further processing obligation. And the idea was, from the 1960s, that an iron ore miner should not only mine iron ore, but should transform that into intermediate products, pig iron, pellets, whatever, but also right through to steel. And that a natural gas producer should not only supply domestic gas or export liquefied natural gas, but should transform those gases chemically to produce a whole range of chemical products. And an alumina producer should be producing aluminium metal. That was the idea. Well-intentioned, sound as an objective. But I must say, 50 years on, largely failed. During the 1990s, as a minister, I tried desperately to achieve that dream of value added. I had some success, but if I look back, limited success, as did my predecessors in that role. As politics is, you do have your ups and downs. I was a deputy leader in the 1990s. We lost an election in 2001, so I went to the political wilderness, as you do. But it did give me time to think. And I rethought, amongst other things, our approach to how we should develop our economy. I still keep to the basic principle that for a small population with a great natural resource endowment, it's sensible to do a limited number of things and try and do them superbly. Excellence counts. But in terms of value adding, it struck me as, why had we failed? And if you think about it, to try and make an iron ore producer become a steel maker is to transform a miner into a manufacturer. And the miners don't want to do it. And why would they want to go into competition with their overseas customers? Similarly, a natural gas producer today doesn't necessarily want to become a chemical company. There was a fundamental flaw of logic. So having realised what now seems to me to be quite obvious, I thought about where does the policy implication go? And instead of trying to change a miner into a manufacturer, I've taken the approach that what we need to do is to attract the customers, the people who buy the natural resources to set up their plant in Western Australia. Then we would get higher value adding within our political jurisdiction. But to do that, two things were necessary. First, we needed purpose-built industrial estates, which were world competitive in terms of infrastructure, port, rail, power, water, in terms of environmental standards and buffer zones, in terms of the availability and skills of a workforce. We had to do that. And the second thing we had to do was to have an abundant, secure supply of energy at a world competitive price. Because after all, the processing of minerals is by definition energy intensive. So that is the policy principle that is now being followed by the government that I'm fortunate to be leading. We're 18 months into it and we're going aggressively down that path. In terms of achieving sites, there are a number of 4 major projects underway in that sense. For the mining industry, particularly iron ore, a place called Oakajee, 400 kilometres north of Perth, will open up a whole new mineral province. The state government, with the support of the Commonwealth government, will be building and owning the deep water port. The private sector will develop the mines, the railways, the minerals handling gear and the like. It's about a $4 billion project, and it will open up an entire new rich and diverse mineral area and will create what I hope will be a truly world competitive industrial site on Australia's west coast. In the further north, in the Pilbara region, about 1,500 kilometres to the north, there are already 3 major iron ore export ports. We propose to develop a 4th at a place called Anketel. I would see that as a private sector project. For natural gas, the other major industry, we are looking at developing 2 sites, one at Onslow in the Pilbara, sometimes referred to as Ashburton North, where projects such as Chevron's Wheatstone and others hopefully will be located. And that will allow a synergy of co-location. Further north, in the far north Kimberley, a very pristine and remote part of the state, we're looking at a place called James Price Point, which will be an area where several LNG projects can locate. So that's a major task, a major commitment of government. If I could now refer to the second aspect and the part that is probably most relevant in Houston, and that's energy. To achieve value adding, to achieve an economic maturity for our state, we have to make use of our energy resources. Now, Australia as a nation is extraordinarily rich in energy. Australia has the 4th largest coal reserves, They are not in Western Australia. They're located on the east coast or the Pacific coast. Fourth largest reserves, Australia is the #1 international exporter of coal. We also have vast uranium reserves. They are dispersed right across the interior of Australia, including Western Australia. Australia has 36% of the world's proven uranium reserves, an extraordinary and strategically significant fact, particularly when you think that the second level of reserves are with Kazakhstan, the third with Russia, the fourth with Canada. Given that most forecasts put the growth in nuclear power at about 45% over the next 20 years, I would think there will be further major expansions of uranium mining throughout Australia, but also in Western Australia, where so far there are 28 known deposits, none of them yet developed, about 4 projects progressing, and I think if you want to look for a very cheap investment with potential high returns, I would look at investing in uranium mining in Australia and particularly Western Australia, even though you're mainly interested in the gas industry. But it's natural gas. It is natural gas that is of most significance in Western Australia. The petroleum industry in our state has increased 8-fold since the early 1990s. It's worth currently about $21 billion and growing rapidly. It's possibly at a stage of development where the Gulf of Mexico was 30 years ago. These are large fields, very high rates of success in drilling, 7 out of 10, sometimes 10 out of 10 success rates. A lot of development yet to happen. Gas is about 21% of world primary energy usage, and the demand for natural gas is generally thought to increase by over 50% internationally by 2030. Over 90% of Australia's natural gas reserves are off the West Australian coast in those 3 principal reserves, the Carnarvon, the Browse and the Bonaparte basins. The proven gas reserves in those basins is 160 TCF. I believe, and I think most in the industry believe, that ultimately those reserves will be proved to be well in excess of 200 TCF. We are still at the early stages. It's not a massive gas resource by world standards, but it is a gas resource that is very underdeveloped. Of that 160 TCF, only 11 have been used so far. Australia as a nation only uses about 1 TCF a year. So this is a 100 resource as it currently stands and an expanding resource. The export of liquefied natural gas began first with the North West Shelf project, which began exporting to Japan in 1989. ConocoPhillips have a project exporting out of Darwin. They are the 2 producers, and Australia is at about 20 million tonnes of LNG. Other projects, the Gorgon project, Chevron, ExxonMobil and Shell began construction around Christmas time on Barrow Island, a $43 billion project, the largest resource project on the planet, and as I understand, for Chevron, the largest project it has ever undertaken either inside or outside of America. Pluto project, led by Woodside, an Australian company, is under construction, and potential future LNG projects include the Japanese-backed INPEX project in partnership with Total, Wheatstone, Browse, Scarborough, Prelude and others. All of these projects are at various stages of formation. The view is, and one that I concur with, is that Australia, and if you like, Western Australia's production, if I can be parochial, of liquefied natural gas will most likely treble to something around 60 million tonnes by 2020. At that stage, Western Australia will be second only to Qatar in the production and export of liquefied natural gas. This is an extraordinary growth experience. I guess the obvious question is, why is that happening? Why is it so high? And why is Australia or Western Australia taking the lion's share of the expansion? And I'll make a few observations about that. First, the liquefaction and export of natural gas is a comparatively new industry. The first trade was in 1964. The first Pacific trade was 1972. It's very much an Asian and particularly an East Asian industry. 2/3 of the demand for natural gas is in the Asia region, principally East Asia. 40% of production is in the Asia region. Put simply, the developing economies of Asia just love gas. And I've spoken to many political leaders over the last 20 years. They all want gas. They all want to have an economy and an energy system which is as clean and as flexible as possible. Australia has some particular advantages. First, our gas resources, while not of Middle East standard, or indeed even US standards in terms of volume, are relatively undeveloped. The Australian market can't use it, and we are close to Asia. The shipping time from Australia to Japan or China is about half of what it would be from the Middle East Gulf states. The other great aspect is the industry in Australia is a private enterprise industry. For years, the North West Shelf project in Western Australia was the only true private sector LNG project in the world. In Australia, you do have to put up with governments, you do have to put up with politicians, but you don't have production sharing requirements, you don't have to do things jointly with state-owned oil companies and the like. Private enterprise has the opportunity of finding gas and developing gas and trading in that gas. And that's, I believe, a strength. Also, as I said at the very beginning, Australia is a first world economy. It has political stability. Well, I certainly hope Western Australia has political stability. It has a stable legal system, and for this industry and some of the technology I've seen over the last 2 days, the protection of such a straightforward thing as property rights becomes important. You have the same sorts of protections as you would have in the United States in those areas. Some of the domestic issues that surround this expansion of natural gas include some issues that may not be so common in some of the other suppliers and producers of LNG, simply because Australia is a first world nation, a top 20 country. For example, environment. There will be no compromise on environmental standards, and I don't think your industry would want that. But can I say the Australian public is supportive of mining and is supportive of petroleum development and take a realistic and pragmatic view. The best demonstration of that is the development taking place on Barrow Island. Barrow Island is a piece of Western Australia, so the land belongs to the state. It is also a piece of remnant Australian continent. There are 24 species of snakes, and lizards and birds on Barrow Island that live nowhere else on the planet. For that reason, for 100 years, it has been a conservation reserve. Chevron in particular has been producing oil there since the 1960s. And because of the standards, exemplary standards of Chevron, the island has been protected. It hasn't had feral species, cats or rats, introduced, and therefore the vulnerable and unique species have survived. On other islands, where the petroleum industry has not been, the native species have often disappeared. And it was because of that history that the Australian and the West Australian public supported the government and supported the industry in seeing the Gorgon project proceed. But the standard is that the construction and operation of that project is almost a quarantined exercise, which adds obviously to expense and is challenging. In other areas, Aboriginal issues, native title, are important. That's the issue in James Price Point. From a government point of view, I would expect and want to see an orderly development of natural gas. I think it's reasonable to say that companies should talk to each other, they should cooperate, whether it's gas swapping, they should coordinate the development of major infrastructure and the way in which they bring on production facilities. I know that companies are by nature competitive, that's a strength of the industry, but my job, my public policy job, is to ensure there is an orderly, sensible development. It is in no one's interest if there is an overinvestment in capacity. That won't help anyone. Dom gas, domestic gas, that's also important. The state has a policy of preserving 15% for the domestic market. That gas needs to be available, it needs to be distributed by pipeline. Our energy grid in Western Australia is a pipeline grid, not a power line grid. Those pipelines are in place, largely in place. But we need energy available and at a competitive price. If that doesn't happen, we won't have the dream of value adding. It will never happen. So that's a policy position I'm sure you can understand. And there are others. Finally, can I make some comments about international trade in liquefied natural gas? The achievement and the growth results China, Japan in the 1960s, India over this coming decade, some of the Southeast Asian economies, is spectacular. Those economies largely came through the recession of the last couple of years in pretty good shape. Growth rates may have dropped a little, but China, India are still having growth rates in the sort of 6 to 10% rate, and with a massive population, the potential to continue to grow for at least the next 10 or 20 years at those sorts of rates. Great achievement. However, most of the countries of the region are still developing. They have some features of the first world economies, they have features of developing nations. I think we need to understand that. And if I could just give almost a brief case study of Western Australia's experience and my experience in our two major export markets. Japan, developed in the 60s, still strong, and China over the last few years. Japan brought Western Australia out of being a small little agricultural-based economy. The post-war redevelopment and reconstruction of Japan made Western Australia important because of its resources and connected us to Asia. Bear in mind, this happened in the early 1960s, 15 years after the end of the Second World War. For my father's generation, who had been a soldier, to contemplate the idea that we would embrace Japan as our new strongest economic partner into the future was an extraordinary matter to contemplate. To the great credit of the then Premier Sir Charles Court and his colleagues, they convinced my father and they convinced his generation that our future lay with Japan. Just 15 years after Australia had faced invasion and my state and other parts of northern Australia had been bombed, many hundreds of people lost their lives. Extraordinary political and social achievement in itself. But it happened. And for Japan, there was the supply of iron ore for steel and then natural gas for electricity and gas distribution. Japan secured access to quality raw materials on a secure basis. And Western Australia saw the development of the Pilbara, the emergence of a major iron ore industry and the start of its natural gas industry. A lot of thought, for obvious reasons, went into that relationship. It was carefully thought out. And the relationship was that Japan would be a foundation customer on basically a take-or-pay basis. It would buy the iron ore for the steel mills and the natural gas. Japan, through the steel mills and the utilities and the trading houses like Mitsui and Mitsubishi, formed partnerships with quality Australian, American and primarily British companies over quality, large, valuable natural resources. And the Japanese trading houses, on behalf of a broader Japan, took small shareholdings in those quality projects. One you'd be obviously familiar with, North West Shelf Project. Mitsui and Mitsubishi jointly hold 16% of the project. They've held that from day one. They hold it today. And the arrangement worked. It was politically and socially acceptable. It gave Japan security of supply and it brought on quality, world-scale development. The iron ore mines, the railways, the ports and the towns were all built within 2 years, and we now have this dominant position. It was out of respect for that relationship that my first overseas trip as a Premier was to Japan, and Japan remains critically important to our state and nation. The second, and what is driving this period of development, is the emergence of a modern China, and India to follow. The development of China came so quickly that there wasn't much forethought to it. And if I can give you just one statistic to demonstrate the point. In 1996, China passed 100 million tonnes of steel production. At that point, it became the world's #1 steel producer. Last year, China produced 567 million tonnes of steel, and production is still growing. The price of iron ore for steel went up 100% 2 weeks ago. Almost insatiable demand. There is a scurry of activity in Western Australia to bring on expansions and new iron ore projects. Extraordinary market force, almost so great to be destabilising. China, I would imagine, looked at the Japan relationship Its interest is Western Australia primarily, because that's where the resources are. It wants security of supply, and it could look to the Japan relationship and see Japan as a shareholder, albeit very small shareholdings, 5, 10, 15%, in major projects, prestigious projects, with quality business partners. And China, I would think, wanted the same. But the preparation for the relationship with China wasn't done. And we had a period where China was making aggressive share market takeovers for small companies, marginal resources. They felt that Australia's foreign investment rules discriminated against China. There were a whole lot of other incidents, some of them commercial, some of them political. This happened over the last 2 years, and probably at about July last year was a low point in Australia and China relationships. I went to China at about that time, by coincidence, and I had one message which I must have repeated 100 times, that your investment is welcome. We want you to find quality projects with quality partners, have small shareholdings and hold them. Now, I'm not saying it's because of my visit, but that is the way the relationship is now going. It is now getting to a maturity, and the lack of forethought, I guess, is not China's fault, it's Australia's fault. Australia did not consider the relationship early enough or carefully enough, but it is being fixed, and the relationship now is in far better shape than it was just 9 months ago. A comment about that is that while China, as a rapidly growing economy, will say, and truthfully say, that over 50% of the Chinese economy is now private enterprise, my dealings with China are not with the private sector. I deal as a state premier with the resources that China wants, with the steel mills, with the gas utilities, with the electricity utilities, with the party secretaries, with the administration in Beijing. All of the businesses, all of the major businesses that are interested in Western Australia are all state-owned enterprises. In a one-party communist state, the leaders of those enterprises invariably highly educated, highly intelligent, but have a dual career. They will at one stage be the head of a state-owned enterprise, or a bank, or a trading house, or financial institution. Their previous career probably had them as a vice-governor or a party secretary. Their future career will probably be a party position in Beijing, and their preferred career will be the party career. They will move in and out. And I will have a dialogue with them that perhaps business doesn't always enjoy. And I know it's an odd thing to say, but politicians trust each other. It's a little bit like honour among thieves, but it's true. And sometimes, particularly with China, the Chinese leadership and the heads of major corporations will say things to me or people in my position which it may not necessarily say to the companies. And I think that's part of understanding the evolution of China in particular. Extraordinary economic performance, but still a developing political and a developing economic system. And I think that will change in time. But right now, personal relationships, government relationships matter. So my role as a Premier in the world's leading mining economy is to make sure our relationship remains strong with Japan, that we get this relationship with China absolutely right, and I think we're pretty close to that, and that I build a similar relationship with India and other emerging economies. The job of the industry is to get out there and find oil and gas and develop it and hopefully make some money and help build our economy and help build your businesses. I simply conclude in saying thank you very much to the courtesy and the hospitality shown to myself and to Lynn tonight, and during this fairly brief visit to the east coast of the US, but particularly to Houston. American business has been critical to the development and success of our economy over the last 50 years. We have an extraordinary period of expansion in front of us. We will only be able to do it with the quality, the technical skills, the expertise and the money of America and American business. There is a sense in Perth, the capital city, that the Americans are back. And it's a sense that has probably been there only for the last 2 or 3 months. And can I say to you, the Americans are back and you are welcome. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Premier, for that excellent presentation. I think you've captivated our audience. The Premier has very graciously agreed to take any questions you may have. Not too many, because we have to have dinner. But if there are any questions from the audience, or even he agreed to comments, I said that's very dangerous in Texas. But if you have some questions or comments, please raise your hand. We'll recognize you, and you've answered everyone's questions. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you.